All right, everyone, we'll get started and people can join as they come along. Firstly, thank you everyone for joining today's first webinar by Clara. My name, firstly, I'm one of the co-founders here at Clara. We're a legal operating system for startups. I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for 18 years. We are trying to disrupt the legal industry, specifically in the tech startup space, by allowing founders to automate their startup legals. Now, we've got a lot of topics to go through today, and I'm going to have plenty of time to answer your questions. There's a lot of content. Don't worry, you're going to get a copy of the slides, and we're going to go into some more detail on some parts and less on others. So the other thing to remember is after this session, for anyone who has additional questions, I'm more than happy to share my Calendly link so that you can have a one-on-one conversation with me on these topics. So we're going to talk about what is an ESOP, which is obviously a key one, why use an ESOP and where they're relevant to particular types of companies. Are all ESOPs created equal? What documents form an ESOP? Where do ESOP shares come from? The KPI versus vesting style of ESOPs, and do ESOPs generally work for everyone? And at the end, what we're going to do is we're going to show you a practical example about creating an ESOP via Clara and how easy it is to add your consultants, your employees, your advisors, or any key stakeholders you're planning to give shares to. Okay, so what is an ESOP? Well, a share incentive plan is also known, well, as a SIP or an ESOP. Now, the reason why it's always known as a SIP or an ESOP is because a lot of people used to think, well, I can't add a consultant or I can't add an advisor to an ESOP plan. But the fact of the matter is they're both the same thing. The key here is that it's a mechanism, it's a plan to allow for people to be offered shares in the company. It allows these employees or consultants or advisors to ultimately get shares in what usually is non-voting shares in the company and over a vested period. So one of the things here is that most employees have to wait over a period of time. So it can be driven by KPIs, or it can be driven by a vesting schedule to allow them to be able to get shares in their particular company. There is multiple documents that come as part of this ultimate share incentive plan. So why do we use an ESOP? Well, the first one is if you're a tech startup, a lot of the time it's to attract talent. Because let's face it, you're going to be dealing with these people having to work for large corporations, large organizations that are paying a higher salary. So if they truly believe in your vision and what you're doing, and they're excited, right, they're going to want to be part of not just the business, but ultimately have some kind of stake in the upside if it goes wildly successful. The other thing is loyalty, okay? They don't want to know that they're working really hard to build a business that ultimately is only for the founders. A startup really is a sum of its parts. And that's why the loyalty around everyone being part of that journey is so important. It aligns interests, okay? Because everyone has got the same ultimate goal to build an amazing venture. And this venture is going to be built and hopefully either commercialized in such a way that it's valuable to someone else, or it's so valuable that one day you ultimately IPO. The other one is ultimately just to retain, motivate people, right? So keep them there. And this is a great way to do it. The other one is an ownership mentality. When every employee owns some shares in a company, it's an ultimate way to ensure that we're all part of the success, we're all part of the growth, and that everyone's contributing to the solutions that build a great company. So how does it kind of work? Well, firstly, it's a right to acquire shares. It forms part of an overall payment package or consideration for an employee or a consultant. And these options are granted a specific price. So an example of an ESOP or a SIP is that you'll go to a particular employee, for example, and you'll say to them, I'm going to give you X amount of shares, and they're going to be vested perhaps over a 4-year period with what we call a cliff, which I'll go into more detail in a second. But you'll notice that I bolded the 1,000 shares, even though it might be worth 2.5% of the company. A key part of this is that it's very important that when you talk to employees or anyone you're giving shares to, you don't talk about percentages. And if you are going to talk about percentages, you talk about what it might mean right at this moment. Because 1,000 shares today doesn't equal 2.5%, maybe in a year or 2 years, as further equity transactions happen in the company. So this is why it's so important to allocate a certain amount of shares, say to them that's what it's worth today, and then allow them to see that those shares will be diluted, just as founder shares are going to be diluted throughout their journey of the company. So how does it work? When you get the shares, let's just say you get 1,000 shares, you'll have a concept called a cliff. And a cliff is like a probation period. Okay, so it's a period where both parties will work together, when no one will incur or vest any shares. Then after a particular time, it might be 3 months, 6 months, a year, you will start to vest the shares. Now, the vesting of the shares can be a kind of a straight line vesting, which means that you'll just do it over a monthly period, or it could be done quarterly or annually, depending on how you want to structure your ESOP. So are they all created equally? Well, short answer is no. So the most easiest ESOPs to create for a startup, and particularly in this part of the world, is when you're in lower tax or no tax jurisdictions, okay? Because then you don't have to deal with the tax implications that can come sometimes with an ESOP. So, for example, if you're looking at AGM, DIFC, Cayman or BVI, you can ultimately gift shares at par value, which means the nominal value that the shares are worth at the time of incorporation. This allows the person to earn those shares, it becomes part of their compensation, and then ultimately when the company exits, the shares that they have vested up to that particular point will be triggered for part of that exit, and so they will take part on the exit of the company. Jurisdictions like Delaware, Singapore, UK, or Netherlands, the way you structure an ESOP can trigger tax obligations. And a lot of people don't realize this because the documents can sometimes be freely available or can be part of a platform. And the reality of it is that sometimes it's worth understanding the tax implications. It doesn't mean you have to pay tax today or the company needs to pay tax. It just means that at some point in time, perhaps on an exit, there might be a capital gains event. And it's just something to be aware of as a founder. So if you do have a topco or a holding company in a tax jurisdiction, it is worth just seeking that legal advice before entering into it. So what documents make up an ESOP? So we start off with the ultimate plan, right? How many shares is the company going to allocate in the company to the wider pool? And that's called the plan. Then there's the grant agreement. This is the document between the company and the individual so that you can actually say how many shares they're getting under what terms. And the one thing about a grant agreement, which we'll go into in more detail, is that with grant agreements, they don't have to be the same for every single person. You might give someone X amount of shares over 2 years with no cliff, and then someone else 4 years with a 12-month cliff. And so the grant agreements can change based on particular situations. Ultimately, at some point when the shares the shares vest, so they build up and they're earned over a period of time, then the employee or the consultant or advisor can exercise those shares. So they say, hey, I want them, and I'm going to sign a document confirming that I want them, and I will pay for them, within a particular period of time. And that's when the shares then get issued. So what documents form an ESOP? So we obviously talked about the plan. This is the key document that the company enters into to get the plan in place. It identifies maybe the participants, how many shares you're going to have in the company, and then it usually delegates the power to someone to say, you can then sign those grant agreements as you allocate grant agreements or share options to particular employees or consultants. The plan goes into other details as well. It does things like restricts a participant from selling their shares, because you might be always thinking, if you give shares to an employee and they were to leave, are they just going to sell it to their friends or to another investor? The answer is no. All these shares are restricted, and they do need board approval in order for them to be sold. The other one that's a key one is setting out a provision called a good leaver and bad leaver. So that means that, let's just say that you were with the company for 3 years, but you had a grant agreement that allowed you to vest shares over 4 years. So on the 3rd year, you decided you wanted to leave for whatever reason. Maybe you were ill, you had to go back to your home country, you didn't want to work in the company anymore, whatever the reason is. As long as you left as a good leaver, then you're entitled to have those shares that are vested up to that particular date staying with the company. The alternative is you're a bad leaver. If you're a bad leaver, you got fired, you've left maybe to go to a competitor, you've taken the idea and started your own startup. So any number of reasons can be a bad leaver, but ultimately they would be breaching the terms of the plan. And when they're a bad leaver, it means that ultimately they have ramifications on their shares that they have, or even the ones that they've already vested. The other thing that the plan talks about is it confirms that the leaver will lose their unvested shares. So a lot of the time people think that, perhaps if you've got you left or the company was to exit on a particular date, that all of a sudden all the shares that were sitting there ready for them to have will get sort of accelerated. And the answer is no. So if there's a particular trigger and you went halfway through your vesting schedule, then the other half will just be returned back into the pool. Okay, so that's a key thing. So the idea is obviously, again, to motivate someone to stay with the company right through to the end of their grant agreement vesting period. It also permits buyback of the vested shares from one of the employees who's got those shares. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why would they be bought back? Well, it basically gives the company that option, regardless of whether they want to exercise it or not. This is very helpful in the sense when sometimes when you get to about a Series B in these investment rounds, what happens is that the VCs might opt to say, we'll buy some of those early employees out that have left the company but invested shares. And what that allows is it means that less dilution of the founding team. So there are times, sometimes, but it's not guaranteed, that there might be a way to buy those shares back. Sometimes the company can be going wildly successfully and may just want to have some cash in the bank and buy some of those shares back. And that might be an option. But the main thing is it provides the freedom for the company to do what it needs to do. If you're a bad leaver, by the way, you're going to ultimately have to give those shares back for nothing. So you'll lose your shares. Now, the grant agreement, after the plan has been created, and let's just say the plan includes 10,000 shares, which might total, for example, 10% of the company. The grant agreement is a document between the company and the individual. And that sets out a lot of the things that we've just touched on. It will always reference the plan, obviously, and they'll be able to review it. But the grant agreement will be very bespoke to their particular needs. So it'll talk about how many shares they're going to get, what's the vesting schedule. So is it going to be over a year, 2 years, 4 years? Is it going to be a cliff? What's the price of the shares? So is it going to be par value or higher or market value? And what is the exercise mechanics? So how regularly is it going to vest, and what will it look like when they do actually vest the shares? Do they have to do something within a particular period of time, such as pay or sign an exercise agreement? And all of that will be in the grant agreement. But it gives also the startup, again, the right to buy back. So that's reinforced in the grant agreement so that the individual is very aware that the shares can be purchased back by the company. Obviously, again, good leaver, bad leaver reasons. But it also talks about a drag along right. So you're never going to get stuck with an employee that sits with 0.2% of the company, decides not to sell out, doesn't like the idea of your exit or the valuation that you've decided to exit on. So the company can always drag them, can grab those shares and pull them along at the same value in which the rest of the company is going. So it does ensure that you are never blocked by having an ESOP. One of the other things is it permits, inside the agreement, it permits the startup to essentially force the parties or the employees, the participants of the plan, to sign any agreements that they may need to sign in future to continue to maybe even give them shares. It might be a shareholders agreement or any other documents may be required, might be for an exit that allow them to, or allow the company to essentially fulfill its obligations to grow and close equity rounds. So that's a key provision in the grant agreement. A lot of these grant agreements, again, we're going to focus today less on US jurisdictions and obviously more on common law jurisdictions. And so the way that our grant agreements work is that it will be done under English law, and the dispute resolution mechanism will be using the ICC arbitration. And the reason we do ICC arbitration is a lot of the time is it's a single arbitrator. You can kickstart it a lot quicker. And it's obviously also confidential. So if you don't want the wider market to know that there is a dispute, arbitrations can be a lot more handy in that sense. So the next document, so you've got the plan, you've got the grant agreement. So the plan saying, hey, you've got 10,000 shares. The grant agreement saying, okay, Bob, you're going to get 1,000 of those 10,000 shares. Now Bob is starting to vest these shares. And if Bob's doing that, then what ultimately happens is at certain trigger points when these vestings take place, in order for Bob to actually convert it from being an option, so that those vested shares can get ready to be actually given to him. And so to do that, it needs to sign an exercise notice. Here are the shares that I've listed from there. So a couple of other things just to remember. All ESOPs will always be, or usually done on non-voting shares. And a lot of that's got to do with the fact that, remember, that when you're giving shares away to any stakeholder that you're going to be giving grants to, it's designed for them to go on the equity ride of the business. You don't need someone to be sitting and being part of a board or being part of the alternate governance of the company. And so there will be a second class of shares in the company. They will be given that second class, that non-voting share, and that is what they will all get. And that's going to be something that will make your life easier, and it will allow everyone else to go in, sign a single document, and get onto the cap table very easily. The other thing is, the benefit of being in low tax jurisdictions is the fact that the exercise price is often essentially virtually nothing. So it's when we look at this, it's the par value. And for any of you that have set up in, say, Cayman or ADGM, you'll know that a lot of the par values are very low. So it can be 1 cent. So by doing that, this allows it to be very affordable for employees to be granted those shares. And as a result of being granted these shares, remember, they form part of the wider compensation package that they're receiving. Now, while you can select any exercise price, so sometimes you can do market value or a percentage of it, the participant would still be required to pay this amount within 3 months of each vesting date. Okay. Now, there are sometimes situations where people like to perhaps hold back the payment until maybe an exit, or pull it together until later. Again, most of the time, it's better for it to be paid, so offset from the salary. You sign the exercise date and you pay. Now, the reason why that happens, even if it might be $10 or $100, is a lot to do with the concept of offer and acceptance in English law. So it allows the transaction to take place, be confirmed, signed, paid, and that person will be legitimately allowed to get the shares in the company. So there will be no argument that it didn't complete. So we're going to talk now about vesting versus KPI-based ESOPs. So the most common one that you'll see, and this is the one that you'll see in most startups, is where you have a vesting period of time. So you'll do something between 2 years to 4 years. They will vest the shares. Maybe it'll be done monthly, quarterly, or annually. It really doesn't matter. Depends on what your needs are. And this vesting is like sort of a straight line vesting. So basically, you're trying to incentivize longevity of that particular person with the company. As part of that, you might have this cliff, and it's quite common. So for example, if you took on a new employee today, you wanted to say that they were part of the ESOP, you may want to give them a cliff equal to their probation, or it might be 12 months so that they work with you for 12 months before they start to vest the shares. Now, the reason for this is not because there's lack of trust or you're trying to hold on to more shares as a founder. It's simply just from an administration standpoint that it's a lot easier than having to give shares, take shares back, and have all these kind of rules associated with whether someone has stayed long enough with you. So that's where the cliff comes in and can be quite handy. Of course, when you decide to bring in an employee share option plan and people have maybe already been with you for about a year, so obviously you can do things like waive the cliff, so there's no cliff there. So they can start vesting the moment that you give them the grant agreement. So this is what kind of a vesting will look like, right? So you'll start off with a cliff, so essentially nothing, and then it will go up until ultimately you've accrued your 100% of shares in the company. So it's quite standard. For those of you that are founders of a startup, you'll notice that it's usually the opposite. So founders have to have a concept called reverse vesting, where you start with all your shares, and if you were to leave partway through your vesting period of, say, up to 4 years, you would have to give shares back. So that's the difference between founders vesting and normal ESOP vesting. Now, the KPI triggers, this is often something that we get asked a lot, which is where people say, oh, but if we reach 1,000 customers, then I want that person to get extra shares. Or if we reach this revenue, I want them to get extra shares. So what we often will say is, although this is fine, it's perfectly normal, the most important thing is to make sure that the the particular KPIs are objective based, so which means that they can be measurable and achievable. Where the risk is with a lot of these KPI ones is where someone might say that, hey, that we want 100, we want 100 customers, and if you do 100 customers, you get this amount of shares. The problem is that what happens if they get 89 customers? Do they get pro rata amount of the shares that were allocated to them? And so a lot of the devil's in the detail here. And so there does need to be a level of discretion from the board when doing this. So what we recommend is that you split the way that your vesting works. And you can give an employer, an advisor, or a consultant as many grant agreements as you want, realistically. So you could give a grant agreement, which is a straight line vesting of just staying with the company for four years, as an example. And then you could just sign a grant agreement with a 1 month vesting if they were to achieve a certain KPI. Now, what this allows you to do is saves you a lot of unnecessary complex drafting. You can just agree conceptually that if they reach certain things, we'll consider a bonus of shares. And then it's up to the board to determine how many shares you're going to give to that person at that particular time. Whereas if you try to draft a lot of this, then ultimately, as you know, there's all sorts of external reasons why this could go wrong. And so it makes it a lot harder. So where do your ESOP shares come from in a holding company? So one of the things that's interesting and gets a lot of founders confused when they're setting up the holding company for the first time is the concept of issued versus authorized shares. And so we're going to talk about where the shares come from. Because when you do an ESOP pool, people think that they've got to transfer 10% of shares of their own shares, and that's not the case at all. So when you set up a company, you've got to think of it like a building, a 10-story building. So that building, when it gets started on day one, has 10 floors of authorized shares. Okay, so just think of it as authorized shares are a whole set of apartments in a 10-story building. On day one, you're going to say the ground floor is the founder's shares. So they're the issued shares. They're the shares that you're going to get on day one. And when you look at who's occupying the building, you don't need to worry about the 9 floors above. You say the occupants are all on level 1 and they own, in theory, or occupy 100% of the building. So then you'll take on investors. As you take on investors, you don't, again, sell your shares. What you're doing is you're saying, that's great. Can you give me some money? Put the money into the company and you're going to get the keys to the upstairs apartment. Okay, so they're going to access the authorized shares that have yet to be issued. So the empty apartments per se. And the same applies then for the employee share option plan. So if you remember right at the beginning of my talk, I talked about the importance of not talking about percentages when you give shares to employees. You give a number of shares. Those number of shares are going to stay those number of shares forever, in theory. And so when those shares are granted, they will have those shares, including the founders, right? If you start off with 500,000 shares as a founder, that's where you're going to be in 5 years' time. It might mean that 500,000 shares don't equal the same percentage as they were on day one, but the concept is the shares are the same with employee shares. So one of the risks that you can always try to avoid is, and the reason why an ESOP is so important to do early on, is to avoid trying to put this kind of language into an employment agreement. You should avoid ever putting any of this language in an employment agreement for a whole raft of reasons. But the number one is you can just put an employment agreement saying you will be eligible to take part in the employee share option plan. And then, and it will be dealt with separately. And that's the key, because it is a separate legal structure, a legal document. Then in that agreement, then you can talk about how many shares they're getting. So otherwise, if you try and put it into the other agreement, the risk is if anything goes wrong on the employment side, you're now affecting the risk of bringing the employee share option plan into a dispute, maybe in local labor courts, which you don't want to do. So are ESOPs right for every company? Well, the short answer is no, right? So the thing is, for all tech companies, the answer is yes. Okay, so all VCs, when you're going to go and get institutional investment, they're going to expect that you have an ESOP in place. And I saw one of the questions earlier that said, when's the right time to do it? And there's a real myth in the market that founders go, well, I'm going to do my ESOP later. I've already promised my employees they're going to get some shares, but I'm just going to leave it until after the investors come in, and then I'm going to put the ESOP plan above it so that they get diluted as well. Well, I'm telling you for a fact that no sophisticated investor is going to accept that. So they're going to want to see that in place almost straight away. A lot of accelerator programs are the same. They're going to want to see it in place. Now, just because it's in place, just because you've allocated those apartments upstairs to the ESOP pool and it might equal 10%, doesn't mean that you've been diluted 10%. It means that over time, as the vesting takes place and they exercise those shares, yes, fine, the dilution will take place. But you need to put the plan in place that allows you then to issue these grant agreements, to do it correctly, to go to investors saying, hey, we've got an ESOP in place. And the reason you do that is when you're sharing your cap table with the wider investor market, they're going to want to see what the fully diluted cap table looks like. So what is it going to look like when all your shares have been granted from your ESOP pool, and what would maybe the conversion of safe notes look like? And so it will allow all the dilution to take place, and they can see a more effective and clearer picture of perhaps what the next round is going to look like. So that's important. The other one is that if you're not someone who's looking to ultimately build a business to sell, like a tech startup, the issue is liquidity. So sometimes you see people trying to give an ESOP in a company that may never exit. So then the question is, other than maybe a profit share through a dividend, they're never going to be able to exit from those shares. And then what ultimately happens is then there's pressure on the other shareholders to have to buy them out at some point, particularly way after they've left the company. So now there are scenarios in terms of liquidity. There are scenarios that sometimes in a Series B venture capital round, that sometimes, as I mentioned before, that there's an option to purchase some of the what we call debt equity. So employees who have left the company that have vested shares and they get purchased, and that's to minimize the dilution of the founders. Now, if ESOPs aren't for you because you've come from an SME and you're not really a tech startup, then really the best option for you is just a percentage of profits. Okay, so just saying, 10% of all profits in the company will be allocated to the staff, and that's a completely separate talk. So the $1 million question: how many shares do I give my employees? Now, firstly, in terms of the pool, probably the most average one, the one that probably everyone sort of starts with, is about a 10% ESOP pool in the company. Doesn't mean you have to do it. You can start with 5%, you can start with 2%, you can start with 20%. But I would just say the average is about 10%. Now, the number of shares you grant in an ESOP is really up to you, and it's up to the board. There's no standard, there's no fixture, there's no situation where you read a book and it says you must do this. When I say 10%, it's because we've got over 1,500 startups, and we've seen how the average is. We've seen what the kind of pools that get generated on day one. Now, in terms of how many shares you give to each person, there's a lot of factors to play. A key part is it's part of a wider compensation. So if you go off and you pay someone market rate, the exact same amount they're going to get from Google or Microsoft, they're likely to get less shares, a lot less shares. If someone's getting slightly less market rate, or you might be really early stage in your company and the risk is high because you're very early stage, which means investment's going to be harder, then ultimately, again, that might give them more shares. The other one is the seniority. The other one might be the impact they have on the growth of the company. So all of these kind of things all take part in how many shares you might give someone. Now, the amount of shares, not the percentages, but the amount of shares you give someone maybe in the early days of the company that's starting with you is usually a lot higher than someone that you might be giving in 4 years' time. Does that mean that you're just giving less shares because you're more established? No, it's also because your company should, in theory, be more valuable. So if your company is more valuable, then you don't have to give as many shares away in order to give the same amount of compensation or remuneration to a particular employee. So that's a key way to think about it. So what are some of the downsides of an ESOP or a SIP? Well, one of the downsides is, it's potential dilution of equity. But if you use a good tool, you'll realize that dilution can absolutely be managed. It's when it's not managed, it's when an ESOP is forced on you at maybe your first major equity round and you're not ready for it because you hadn't taken that into account. Things like that, that's when it can be a real problem. The other one on the downside of an employee side is lack of liquidity. Okay, sometimes it can sit there for many, many years and they might be wanting to value those shares and want to be able to cash them out in some shape or form. And so they know that they can only cash it out, obviously, if the company sells or IPOs. And not necessarily it's a downside, it's probably also an upside because they're obviously, everyone's aware that growth of the company is a key part of seeing that value of those shares going up. So everyone is aligned as well. So the key takeaway for any ESOP is don't reinvent the wheel. One of the risks is the more you try and generate different concepts, different ways of doing it, the more challenging it will be both to manage it and it will be very difficult for you to ultimately make it work, because the more complex you have it, particularly if you give different arrangements to different people that is not in a structured way, you're going to find yourself in a position where you're going to probably end up in some kind of dispute. So streamline it, go down the path that everyone's doing. When you get to Series A, you get to Series B, you've always got an opportunity to reflect and review the terms. And the other thing as well with an ESOP is that you might be thinking, what happens when you run out of 10%? What happens then? You will ultimately, in future equity rounds, they usually top up the ESOP pool. That might be only 2.5% this time, or it might be 3%. So it can change. So that's how the ESOP pools get topped up as you go along. So if you looked at really large international companies, or companies like Kareem, they would have had to have topped up their ESOP pools many times over the 7 or 8 rounds that they did. Okay, now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you quickly about how to use Clara to create your ESOP, and then we'll be able to answer some of your questions on this. So just one second. Okay. So now on Clara, for those of you that have not used Clara before, you'll be coming into when you put all your company in, you have your holding company set up, you can do lots of different things, but today we're just going to focus on generating the ESOP plan. So you go to the generate the documents, and when you come up, you'll be going to the share incentive plan. And again, this is the plan. It will tell you a bit about what it does. Use the document. So if I go ESOP 1, and I select the company, it'll always be the holding company. One thing to note as well for you, that for those of you that are thinking of doing an ESOP in an operating company, firstly, you need to make sure that if you were to do it and it was DIFC or EDGEM, that's one thing. But I would caveat in saying that more you do at an operating company, even if you legally can do it, it's a real mess having to clean it up later when you get a holding company. So always the recommendation and the best practice is get your holding company set up as soon as you can, get the ESOP set up, get everything structured in the right place, because what it does, it minimizes having to do either novations or terminate agreements or get people to sign agreements for a second time around, and it just gets a lot more admin for a founder. So once the details are set up, so we know what the holding company is, and we go down here, we're going to know that Fiona is one of the founders and she can sign on behalf of the company. Now, this is where we talk about how many shares are going to be in the plan. So let's just say, for argument's sake, it's 10,000. The currency is going to be US dollars. Okay. And if it's an EDGEM company, we'll do it as the par value, which is 1 cent. Now, the effective date, again, it can be, the effective date can be in the past. So you can be in a situation where you could say, for example, 1 January 2022, and then you would generate the agreement. The plan has all of the things that we mentioned in the presentation. And once that share incentive plan is created, you can then review it, you can save it, and you can download it in Word and review it again, and you can re-upload it. When you press the Get Signatures, it goes out to Fiona, who can sign it, and Fiona will sign it. Once it's signed, it creates the plan inside the platform. So once that plan is being signed, we would come back and we would then create the grant agreement. Now, if you remember in the presentation, I said the grant agreement can be bespoke for each individual. The grant agreement can also be beyond employees. So you're going to use the grant agreement for advisors, for employees, and for consultants, or anyone you're giving some shares to as a result of some form of compensation or some part of your growth. So if we went and did the grant agreement, came up here. So let's just say that we're going to give Bob grant agreement. And we're going to say, okay, Bobby, you're going to get some shares. And we know Bobby's from Canada. And In this case, obviously, it's a demo account, but we're going to say that it's one of the SIP that we've created. And we go down here, that's fine. So the corporate signatory is Fiona. Now, this is where we work out how many shares. Now, we know that there are 10,000 shares, so we're going to say you're going to get 1,000 shares. The exercise price is going to be 1 cent. Okay, the vesting start date, we know it started, the plan started in January last year. So let's just say that it's going to be 1st of June or May 2022. The vesting period is going to be, let's just say for 3 years, so 36 months. Vesting frequency is monthly. Now, quarterly, annually, the reasons you can choose one or the other, it doesn't really matter. The key thing with monthly is that obviously it breaks it down and accrues it slowly over the year. Annually obviously means that it's a bit like paying a bonus in a corporate environment where once that bonus is paid, a big lump sum exercise will trigger at a particular time. So really up to you. Probably the most common one's monthly. Now, is there a cliff? Let's just say that there is a cliff and the cliff is going to be 6 months. Place of arbitration, it's going to be ADGM, okay, Abu Dhabi. And then we're going to generate the agreement. Now, this agreement will be obviously bespoke to that particular individual. You'll create it. And again, if you want to share it with them, or you press the get signatures and it will go out and they can review the terms of the agreement. One of the things our system does is, as you can imagine, when you're giving a grant to perhaps an employee or someone who isn't used to reading long-form employment or long-form agreements, then we create a frequently asked questions document, which allows them to read it in sort of plain English, where they can see a question that they might be asking, like, hey, can I sell them? When can I cash out? What happens if I leave? All of those things are answered so that that'll form part of their grant agreement when they get this sent to them. So once these two documents are signed, right, you're going to be able to know that it automatically comes into the cap table. And you will then come into the cap table, and then you'll be able to see that in the share options, we can see that Bobby has been given some shares. Okay, and then with Bobby, we'll be able to go at any one time, look at the share options, and you'll see that with the shares, we'll be able to look at the vesting schedule and see that he has vested some of the shares, okay, for a period of time, and there are some that are unvested. Now, because there's a demo account, what would happen is if he had signed this, you would have an exercise notice here where you'd be able to press the button, generate the agreement, he'd sign it, and it would go from vested to being moved on the cap table as being that they're going to be soon issued shares. And so that's one of the benefits of all being automated in the system. And this becomes incredibly important when you start having large amounts of employees, and employees need to go and come, and as that happens, you need to be able to manage all of this in a sophisticated way. That way, when you come back to the cap table and you go to the fully diluted cap table, you can come down here and you can see what it would have looked like if everyone had got the shares that they're entitled to. So you can start seeing what the full dilution of the founders' shares look like. So that's one of the benefits of doing it there. Okay, so that is how you create an ESOP and a grant agreement and ultimately an exercise notice all through Clara. Let's answer some questions now. Okay, so the first one that came right at the beginning was, when's the best time to include an ESOP in the cap table? Well, again, because it's just an option pool, my view is the second you set up the holding company, you should create the plan. Because once it's there, then you can start to give these grant agreements out as people start joining your company. You can obviously put long vesting, long cliffs in that grant agreement. So there's no reason for you to hold out. Dilution of or waiting for investors to come in won't make a difference, because realistically, you're probably going to have safe note holders in your up until Series A anyway. So it really won't make a big difference. The next question is regarding ESOP granting. It is hard to understand that the ESOP is not reserved, and we need to every time issue shares and change the cap table. So as the exercise notices are signed, they ultimately will move from being vested over to being ultimately exercised, and they will move on to the cap table. One thing to note is, just because, for example, you're vesting shares monthly does not mean that you need to go off and update Cayman or ADGM or DIFC every month. The benefit of it is that if you've got an arrangement with your employee And as a company, you can pull them together all at once a year or every 2 years or whenever you're doing the next equity round and do a nice big cleanup of all your shares, right? But the point being is, as long as you're monitoring the vesting and they're signing the exercise notice, it will allow you to know at any one time how many shares have been vested up to a particular point, right? So if you're doing your Series A next week, right, and you've got all sorts of employees at different stages of their vesting, you'll be able to know at a particular time that that's how many shares need to be granted to all those employees so that the cap table is nice and clean. Next question. I just want to understand if the employees' option not to execute ESOP and not pay taxes, wait until it's reasonable. So yeah, so this is a good question. So again, we're dealing largely in non-tax jurisdictions, but for those of you that are dealing with people in a tax jurisdiction and have to pay tax, well, that's just the reality of where the employee might reside. So if that employee is residing in a tax jurisdiction and they're a tax resident of that particular country, well, they're going to need to seek their own legal advice. Once the company starts to get involved in doing this kind of stuff, we're trying to assist them in any way other than what should be standard, then it's definitely worth you getting some legal advice around that, because ultimately it's important for you guys just to stick with the right plan based on where your holding company is structured, and it's up to the employees to determine whether or not they're going to be paying tax or not. So in terms of Bilal, your question, when you're doing the standard share incentive plan, what are some of the common edits you might make? Well, the reality is between now and Series A, I would say that there's not many that you would need to make. And the more that you look to make, for example, maybe changing the way that perhaps bad leaver or good leaver or the percentages that might be, if you had to buy back those shares, what percentages you'd buy back those shares and things like that. The risk with that is the more you play around with the plan, the more likely you're going to probably need to seek some legal advice. So our advice is always just to stick with a standard plan. Remember, your key for a startup is just to get to your next, obviously, Series A or your next series round, and try not to reinvent the wheel, which is the same thing as what I said on my last slide. Because the more you try and reinvent the wheel with a lot of these things, the more complexity you bring into your startup, the more chances you're going to have something go wrong. Walla, yes, you will get the presentation. DIFC, ADGM, they're both good jurisdictions. Yeah, we can have a chat about that, Ivan, separately. Okay, so how are things different for a company set up in BVI versus UAE free zone? Well, there's a lot, to be honest, because as you can see, when you're talking about an ESOP, you're talking about things like options, buybacks, drag along rights. These things are almost impossible to enforce on non-common law jurisdictions. So if you try to do that on onshore or a free zone, you would have to go to the onshore courts for enforcement. You know, if the person wasn't in the country and you're trying to enforce a drag right, it's a mess. So that's why you don't do ESOPs on places where, you know, it's not recommended. And that's why, by the way, startups get holding companies. This is not because there's a conspiracy theory in the market that everyone needs two companies. It's just because it's structured so that it works for founders and it works for investors. And these kind of concepts like ESOPs just work. So rather than trying to put it into all these kind of random jurisdictions. And by the way, it's not just a UAE problem, it's many countries around the world. That's why wherever you are in the world, it's very likely you're going to have a second company or a holding company. Yes, in Europe, you're right. So the next question, Akshay, is that the exercise price is reflect the independent company valuation. That's the same as in the US. That's why I didn't want to deal with that in the presentation. But again, in the UAE, because the UAE is a tax-free jurisdiction, there isn't that requirement. The whole concept of having an exercise price and then going at market value is largely around recording capital gains. Okay, so again, it's something you don't need to worry about in Cayman, DIFC, or ADGM. So that's why par value works. Click periods, Mo, talking about monthly or quarterly vesting. So again, monthly allows, if you're giving shares to employees really for longevity and for them to go over, say, a period of 4 years, the idea is that if they were to leave, they're going to leave anyway, and at least you just stop on that particular month. With monthly and annual, again, they're all perfectly fine and everyone uses all different ways. The thing is with annual is that it's a bit like those, if you've ever spoken to a HR person in a large corporate, you'll know that when bonuses get paid, the next day everyone resigns that wanted to leave. So that's the downside of doing one big lump sum annual vesting. So that's why we think that, say quarterly or monthly is better. But again, it can be entirely up to you and how you want to do it. One thing to note, by the way, on the vesting schedule is some people choose to layer their vesting. For example, they might find that the last month also the last year is a higher amount of shares that they get, and it's lower in the first few years. So things like that can help a lot if you want to try and keep them staying right until the end. So what's the difference between allocated and unallocated ESOP? Well, that's ultimately meaning, so it's vested and unvested. So that's what the term there is. And so if it's unallocated, and let's just say that you sold the business tomorrow, they would just essentially go back into the company. They wouldn't be issued, and everyone's shares would go up slightly by the amount of shares that weren't allocated. So you'll see, remember the three terms here are vested, unvested, which means they've been granted but yet to be vested, and then they're unallocated. And so that's what you're going to monitor. And that's when you're doing a fully diluted cap table, it's going to reflect those three specific things. Can people exercise their shares before an equity round? Well, in terms of when we're talking about exercising, we're talking about ESOPs. Yes, they can ultimately, if you're vesting the shares and if you want to update and give them the shares before an equity round, absolutely, because they're entitled to do it. Remember, when they exercise the shares, they're going to be on the cap table as a shareholder, right, as they go along. So right before the equity round, that's what's all going to get cleaned up in the cap table. Ivan, again, on the idea about when to do the ESOP. Do the ESOP as soon as you've set up your holding company. There's no purpose to wait for the investors. When the investors come in, you go to any sophisticated accelerator program or VC, they will say to you, that's great, I'm going to give you $1 million or $10 million, but we want you to have an ESOP in place, and it's all going out of the founder's shares. They are not interested in giving you money and then finding immediately after they've signed the documents, they're going down by 10%. So if you know that's going to happen, and you know that having an ESOP is going to help you employ people, it's really helpful to do it as soon as possible. Again, you can have an ESOP and literally only grant 1% out of the 10% if you want. That's a matter for you. But it's one of those things where I think having it in place helps your cap table reflect exactly what it's going to look like. And it will make you make decisions around equity raises, so that when you're doing modeling and understanding what will it look like if I raise this amount of money at this cap or this valuation, you'll be able to take into account what the fully diluted ESOP dilution will look like. Can ESOP be increased, the company grows? Absolutely. Yeah. So as I mentioned, you might start with 10%. That might get you to Series A. It might get you halfway through past Series A. But ultimately, the top-ups on an ESOP don't need to be as big. So it's not like you're doing 10%, 10%. The next might be 5. The next one after that might be 3. The next one might be 1%, because you don't need to top up as much in order to give the value you need in terms of a share. So for example, 10 shares in 7 years' time is the equivalent of 20,000 shares or 10,000 shares now, for example. So that's why you don't need to give as much of the company away at that particular time. Yes. So can remotely based employees participate in ESOPs? Absolutely. And again, the ESOP is based on the company where your holding company structured. So if it's ADGM or Cayman, you'd have the ESOP. And that's why when I was doing the ESOP presentation, I was mentioning consulting agreement and employment agreement and or advisors. So regardless of where they are in the world, they're entitled to be part of the ESOP from the holding company. Okay. And then the next one is, do we have to split the cap table in the beginning and show the ESOP pool from the authorized capital? No. So how the ESOP will work is it'll be part of your fully diluted. So then you'll see on a cap table, there'll be issued shares. So what actually are being issued by the holding company. And then the other part will what we call fully diluted, which means assuming that all the shares that you've granted are all reflecting into the cap table and everyone gets diluted accordingly. So there will be different versions of the same cap table. Okay, what's the difference in documentation between granting options and straight equity? Well, straight equity will require a subscription agreement, and you would need to give them, and you would need to sign a subscription agreement. You would need to then onboard them and perhaps give them a Class B non-voting share if that's what you want to do. It's slightly different. The difference with a share incentive plan is that you're giving essentially free equity away over a period of time based on a vesting schedule. So it's slightly different. So if you went to just go and give straight equity, yes, you would have to perhaps engage a lawyer and get a subscription agreement drafted. Okay, so in the scenario of acquisition, how does acceleration of vesting work? So there is no acceleration, at least on Clara's ESOP. If you're halfway through, that's what you'll get. And the other half will, because remember, when a company is acquired, most of the time, it'll depend on the terms of the acquisition, but it's still going to be a continuing going concern. So it might be that there's a deal to be had around that person staying on and continuing to vest the shares. It might mean that they're given some kind of bonus by staying 2 more years. Who knows what it might be? But the key thing is there's no acceleration of the shares. So you don't just sit there and you've been there for 3 months and all of a sudden you're going to get the benefit of a 4-year vesting. So we have multiple companies under one holding company. Can we issue ESOP from one of the companies? So again, if you've got a holding company, the ESOP sits at the top. You never do an ESOP with a subsidiary level. If you do it at a subsidiary level, what happens is you're going to give shares to companies that will never exit. So if someone buys a holding company, you're going to be in a situation where these people are sitting in the subsidiary in a particular country going, how am I getting money out of this? They're not, right? So what you need to do is if you're giving shares based on a group and people in different countries, then what you can do is you just have to come up and work out how many shares you're going to give them according to their particular role in the business. Want to make an ESOP for my co-founders plus another for the future employees. Sorry, co-founders don't need an ESOP. So co-founders will get shares on day one. And then what happens is you've got a concept of reverse vesting. So if you had 20% of shares, you would have, and they left in 2 years, you'd have to get back that 10% of shares, for example. That's what reverse vesting means. Whereas an ESOP is very easily created. And then you just do it through Clara, and then you'll be able to work out how many shares you want to issue, and then give the grant agreements based on the different employees. But the rest of the questions probably need to have a one-on-one session. Okay, so that's a good question. So if an exercise notice is submitted to the company and yet it hasn't been allotted, does the employee still hold the shares? Well, they have a legal right over those shares. They may not have actually had the issued shares with the company, but if something happened and the company got sold, they've obviously have a right to say, well, that's great, but I'm technically a shareholder. So they have an enforcement right. So, but that's a key thing. Remember, if the company was going to sell, it'd be part of the due diligence anyway to see that people have signed exercise notices, and it would all be cleaned up at that time. But yes, if it's signed, you're basically one step away from holding that shareholder certificate. So if the company is own funded, no investment made so far, can we issue ESOP? Absolutely. Again, one of my slides was talking about as long as the company that you have is designed to be built for ultimately an exit, then an ESOP is handy to have. So if that's the case and you're building it, if you're not and you're not building it for an exit, then look at alternatives like profit sharing. In a grant agreement, can you set an exercise price that's lower than the par value? No, right? The lowest is par value, but again, it's 1 cent. So you'd be basically doing zero. And that comes back to the concept of consideration in English law. So par value is a key thing, a part of the grant agreement. Okay, next question around Cayman and Delaware sandwich. We'll probably have to have a chat separately, connect with me. So in Clara, do I have to enter the issuance manually, or does it do it automatically? It does it automatically. You'll have a vesting schedule. It'll tell you that it's been vested, and then there will be ability for the exercise notices to be granted and generated from the system. So all you've got to do is sit there and just monitor your cap table as it sort of slowly populates. How can you get the slides? I'm going to send you a QR code in 1 second. Are advisory shares part of the ESOP? Absolutely. This is how you do it. So when you do an advisory agreement, at the end it will say, you know, you're going to get 100 shares as a result of being an advisor for 3 years. And then the question is, how do they get those shares? And they'll do it through by getting a grant agreement. The question here is, what is the difference between share options and RSUs? That's a very US question, Abida. So it's slightly different. RSUs are often linked to founders. Again, that's not, today we're kind of concentrated on more common law jurisdictions. You mentioned ADGM and DIFC. What about DMCC? Again, it's not because the DMCC, just a lot of things like drag rights don't work in DMCC. So we focused on holding companies, and that's where all VCs are going to expect all startups, regardless of where they're operating from, are going to have a holding company. So, you know, you can be in any jurisdiction you want, but when it comes to having an ESOP and a holding company, they're expecting you to have a holding company in a jurisdiction that's acceptable, such as ADGM, DIFC, Cayman, you know, maybe Delaware. Okay, great. So I'm just going to show you, so I'm going to put my slides up for those who want the slides. 1 second, sorry. Okay. Okay, thanks everyone. If you've got any other questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, also, we'll be sending around an email with my calendar link if you want to have a one-on-one session. I know there was a lot of information to go through today. This was just sort of an introductory to the concept, but I'd love to be able to talk to you more about your specific needs.